Good evening. I'm Paul Chace. I'm the director of this new academic unit at Arizona State University, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and I'm very glad all of you could join us for the 9th event in the school's 2018-2019 series we've entitled Polarization and Civil Disagreement, Confronting America's Civic Crisis. The series this year has included individual speaker events with interviews, dialogue events, and a 2-day conference that we held in February. We are glad to have as co-sponsors again the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. This series on polarization and remedies for it is the sequel to our 2017-2018 series on free speech and intellectual diversity in higher education and American society. And we are collaborating again this year with Arizona PBS to record all of these events in the series as they did for our inaugural series. All the episodes air on Channel 8 locally, and then they're archived on the PBS website. And all the video is also available on the SCETL website. Look for the video tab across the top. That's true of all our public events outside of our main series. We have an annual Constitution Day lecture, an annual Martin Luther King Day lecture, and plenty of other speaker events. The aim in all of this is to provide a public forum for civil disagreement and debate. So I'm always glad to see with us colleagues from other units at Arizona State University and members of the Phoenix community. We were supposed to have 1 or 2 members of the state legislature here today. And I do want to mention one person who's in the audience with us, former U.S. Senator John Kyle is here today, and he has joined the school and our Center for Political Thought and Leadership in a leadership role for us. He and Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, have agreed to be the co-chairs of a new board of counselors that we have to advise us on our civic education programs and to help us emphasize this theme of civil disagreement and civil discourse. So just a few words more about the school's mission and the larger rationale for this series, and then I will introduce our distinguished speaker. The School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership is seeking to restore the connection between liberal education and civic education in the American university. And we try to undertake civic education efforts not only within our own students, but in the broader community. Our students in our courses study classic works of moral and economic thought, of political economy, American political and economic thought. We also organize this speaker series and other speaker events to promote discussion, not only in the classroom, but beyond, of vital academic and civic issues. We also have intensive international courses we've developed in India and in Israel and the West Bank to allow American students to see liberal democracies in other regions of the world. Everyone who's here is welcome to pick up information that we have in the lobby area about our curriculum, about our courses for the fall, and we also ask you to spread the word, of course. This diverse curriculum and broader educational program is a way of expressing our view that a return to some fundamental ideas and debates can provide a broader and calming perspective for students and citizens and leaders in this very polarized era. On the theme of debate, one last word before introducing Walter. We have a special co-sponsor for tonight's event, the ASU chapter of the national organization called the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is devoted to elevating high-level discussion, but also awareness of issues about American foreign policy and international affairs. We have some of the SCETL students who are leaders in that organization here with us tonight. So now to our speaker. Walter Russell Mead is the Curry Distinguished Fellow in Strategy and Statesmanship at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the Global View columnist with the Wall Street Journal, and he is the James Clarke Chace Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College in New York. Before joining the Hudson Institute, Mead was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations as the Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy. He's authored numerous books as an historically minded scholar and analyst of the United States and its place in world affairs, including the widely recognized Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World from 2002. 2 other books I'll mention, Power, Terror, Peace, and War, America's Grand Strategy in a World at Risk from 2004, and God and Gold, Britain, America, and the Making of the Modern World, 2008. His next book is on a thoroughly placid and uncontroversial topic, The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. In 2012, the Foreign Policy Research Institute awarded him its Benjamin Franklin Prize for his work on American foreign policy, and Mead is a founding board member of New America and also serves on the board of Freedom House. So we'll have three parts to tonight's event. First, Walter will have a presentation. In the second part, I will pose some very angry and polarized questions to him about foreign policy and polarization in America. And in the third part, Walter will take questions from the audience. So please join in welcoming to the podium for a discussion of Still at the Water's Edge, Partisanship in Foreign Policy, Walter Russell Mead.
Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here, especially to be here in March. I understand that in June, July, and August, the nicest thing anybody has said to me is, well, it's a dry heat. And I actually, before, while I was planning the talk, I talked with some of the faculty here. And I said, well, what kind of talk should I give? And they said, well, first of all, it should be a long talk. I said, really? They said, yeah, ASU students are very serious people. They're insulted if you don't really give them something substantive, meaty, and long. I said, well, do they like, entertaining anecdotes and funny stories? No, they'll be furious if you do that. I said, well, but surely they don't want me to use like big technical political science jargony words. He said, no, jargon is great. It will make them feel they're really getting a lecture. I said, well, how long do you mean? And they said, well, think of Fidel Castro addressing the Hall of Delegates on the anniversary of the revolution. 6 hours, 8 hours, it doesn't really matter. I thought about it for a while and realized they weren't paying me enough to give that kind of speech, so I hope you'll be okay with what I do instead. Politics stopping at the water's edge, that's a phrase that people use when they want to talk about bipartisanship in foreign policy. I've noticed a couple of things over the years about bipartisanship in foreign policy. Usually when somebody says there needs to be more bipartisanship in foreign policy, they mean the other party should adopt my foreign policy positions. That bipartisanship is generally something you want other people to do while you're in charge. But also, as I have looked back at American history, what I've seen is that foreign policy has been pretty ornery and contentious in this country going back a very long time. We all love to think of the great golden age of the statesmen of the past, the Marshall Plan, NATO, those wonderful things that happened after World War II. People forget that in 1952, at the height of this Cold War institution building, Richard Nixon was elected vice president after running around the country denouncing Dean Acheson's cowardly College of Communist, appeasement, and attacked the striped pants pinkos and cookie pushers in the State Department. So even at what people, and Eisenhower was no slouch in the foreign policy department either. So even at what we would consider a very, very grand moment in the history of American foreign policy, the knives were out. Those were the years of the McCarthy scares. Those were the years of isolationism. It was a tough time. It's always been a tough time. Go back to the administration of George Washington, right? George Washington didn't believe there should be parties. He didn't think we should have a bipartisan foreign policy. He didn't think we should have two parties. We should all be Americans working together for the common good. What created the first party system in America, and it was a very bitter party system, was a fight over whether the United States should ally with Britain or with France in the wars of the French Revolution. And that was a quarrel that many people thought could break up the young republic. but the Jeffersonian Republican Democrats thought we should ally with France in a kind of revolutionary war against England, and the Hamiltonian Federalists thought we should side with England and that France was really a bunch of atheists and it was very problematic. It's interesting, by the way, we have some members of the Alexander Hamilton Society here. Would you raise your hands, members of the Alexander Hamilton Society? Okay, I do see we have quite a few. I think that's that's an appropriate society to talk about the importance of civil discourse when you think how Alexander Hamilton ended up. Basically murdered by a political rival in a duel. Again, polarization is not something that Americans suddenly discovered after the invention of cable news. Polarization, when I was the age of some of these bright young students here and still had a hopeful future rather than a disappointing past in prospect, America was riven in twain by the civil rights movement, the marches on desegregation. We had riots every summer in the major cities of the United States. I see there's some of the folks with gray hairs are nodding their heads as I bring back these memories. The Vietnam War, which was, we lost 10 times as many Americans in the Vietnam War as we did in the Iraq War. Plus, there was a draft, so it was something that you either had to develop a case of bone spurs or you would have to go to war. And it was I lucked out, by the way. There was a draft lottery my year, and they would they would pull birthdays out of a kind of a goldfish bowl. And my number was 279, which meant that if Russia invaded Canada, I would probably be called up. But that short of that, I was okay. So no bone spurs. Anyway, the partisanship, the division, the hostility, the violence in the streets was all at levels we have not come close to today. So don't worry, kids. You've still got some peaks to scale. We have been more polarized than we are now, more divided in partisan politics than we are now, and we got out of it okay. So that, I think, is one thing we should all remember about periods of polarization, and it might help. Again, that polarization around the time of the Marshall Plan and the beginning of the Cold War, that did not lead to the country falling apart. That did not lead to our inability to contain Russia. It actually led to a sustained period of American leadership around the world that was a golden age for people all over the world. So contention, polarization, and quarreling do not predict a terrible future. In American history, these things more often than not have been the sort of means by which we get ourselves to a better place. As the world changes around us, as American society changes, old ideas have to be questioned. Old institutions have to be reformed. Sometimes old politicians have to be made to retire. But I'm not talking about anybody in particular, Senator Kyle. No, this is the way, this is the way a society like ours changes and grows. And you can't expect a collection of 300 million people who have very different views, very different life experiences, very different cultural backgrounds in many cases. They're just not all going to agree the minute some new idea pops up. And our society processes these in a political process, which, except for the Civil War, has always led to peaceful resolution. All right. So polarization has been part of our foreign policy, and we've been as much divided over foreign policy as we have over domestic policy much of the time, because in fact the difference between foreign policy and domestic policy is not as big as people will sometimes tell you it is. So for example, trade policy is obviously foreign policy. Are we going to, for example, with the TPP, the Pacific Trade Agreement that was rejected, were we going to try to strengthen our alliances in the Pacific as a way of possibly affecting China's behavior in the future through this set up some common rules or not? And we decided we weren't going to do it. Well, that's a foreign policy issue, but at the same time, these think trade policy is a domestic policy issue too. For example, in trade negotiations, you never get everything you want. You have to make deals with the other side. Well, are you going to sacrifice the interests, say, of soybean growers and farmers, or are you going to sacrifice the interests of Silicon Valley companies with their intellectual property? They're going to be domestic winners and losers in a trade agreement, even if overall the trade agreement is on balance good for the United States. And you can't expect people to debate these things without thinking about their impact. It's one reason in American history our farm states for 200 years, the American farm states have generally been pro-free trade, because American agriculture is so productive that, just sort of 2 counties in Iowa could feed practically our whole country. And if the farmers in America are going to make a living, it's going to only be because we're able to export farm goods abroad. Well, other countries will only do that often if we are willing to accept their exports in return. So any time Americans develop a trade bill, just look in there and you'll see that agricultural interests are consulted, are taken care of. Now, there are limits, because other countries are very sensitive on some of these issues too. The French, for example. But nevertheless, a trade debate with a trade negotiation with another country or another group of countries is also a political battle in the United States between different interest groups. Energy policy. Probably the most important development in international politics in the last 5 years has been that the United States has gone from being a major importer of hydrocarbons to becoming an exporter of hydrocarbons, and we are now the world's largest oil and gas producer, which is kind of amazing. That changes a lot of things in the world. It changes Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia are all looking at something like $1 to $2 trillion less revenue over the next 10 years or so than they could have expected otherwise. But it also means, for example, that Americans are less interested in getting involved in the Middle East, perhaps, than they might otherwise be. 25 years ago, the average American was pretty well convinced that the pump at their gasoline station was connected to Saudi Arabia. And so anything that affected the security of Saudi Arabia might affect whether or not you would be able to drive your car, and certainly what kind of price you would pay for something that you had to buy all year long. If that connection is broken, then America has to rethink its Middle East policy in various ways. But at the same time, the balance of politics in the Middle East changes. Well, that's a big deal. But energy policy is also a domestic policy issue. For example, we're fracking all this shale, all the shale oil and gas. Well, what is this going to do about climate change and CO2 emissions? Yes, for a while, the natural gas is going to replace coal, and so that's really going to make a positive difference. But in the long run, isn't a huge gushing supply of oil and natural gas just going to make the fight against climate change that much harder? Well, that's a political argument. And people in the United States feel very strongly about both sides of that question. And you can't tell them, oh, don't get so worked up, it's only climate change. Or on the other hand, why are you so upset? It's only your job that we're talking about. Of course people are going to be engaged and angry, and they're going to want to see their side prevail because it matters. And we don't all see everything the same way. By the way, my father was a minister, Episcopal minister, and when I started giving talks, he gave me some advice, which is very useful. He said, look, when you're giving a talk, you're going to find at some point, no matter how great your talk is and inspirational, you're going to see that you're losing your audience. You know, they just start kind of like drifting off a little bit. Their eyes aren't, you lose the eye contact. They're fiddling with their phones, whatever it may be. He says, but there's one surefire way to get them back when you see that happening. I said, well, Dad, what is that? He said, just start saying things like, finally, and in conclusion. He says, they perk right up. Maybe the most valuable piece of advice I ever got. All right. So, in any case, foreign policy and domestic policy are connected. And the passions that drive our political disagreements domestically often affect our international problems too. And this connection is getting getting closer and harder to ignore. Part of this is because of globalization, so that, you know, if people think that their jobs are going to Mexico or their jobs are going to China, they're going to look at trade negotiations or other questions in a very different way. But it's also, if you think about it, the American frontier is no longer hundreds or thousands of miles away. All right? The American frontier is in your iPhone. It is in your kid's computer. Because the internet, this thing that you're connected with, is international. There may be foreign cyber criminals stealing identity and passwords. They may be hacking your elections. There are all kinds of things that can be happening now remotely. And so this also affects your sense of security. Russia is not a nice, safe 4,000, 5,000 miles away. You know, Russia is looking out of my computer monitor when I turn the thing on, maybe. So, international life has come closer. This process was part of American life all during the 20th century, if you think about it. In 1920, basically the only way any other country could get at us was they had to build a navy and get it over here and attack us. This is why American diplomats spent 1920 working very hard on naval disarmament agreements. Because if you could just get everybody to limit the size of their navies, we could go to sleep, and we did. It didn't work out that well in the end, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. But again, by 1941, we discovered that actually, well, they could at least get to California, not on ships, but in planes. During the Cold War, we made the very unpleasant discovery that they could get here on intercontinental ballistic missiles and get here very quickly. And now, with the development of cyber war and cyber technology, we realize they might already be here and we might not even know it. And that people talk about scenarios like, you know, they take down the electricity grid, or they hack the system controlling a hydroelectric power station and release the floodgates. All kinds of things could happen. Hopefully they won't, but maybe they could. So our connection to threats from overseas has been growing. And I think that is going to inevitably make people a bit more passionate about, it's kind of how am I safe? How do I keep predators away from my kids on the internet? Those are not abstract questions. How do we preserve the balance of power in Eurasia? Okay, those are how do I and my family stay safe? All right. Now, I've been talking about how like this isn't the end of the world and our polarization is not so terrible, but some of you may have noticed a certain spirit of polarization and even partisan rancor making its appearance in American politics. I don't know if any of you people watch this phenomenon they call cable news, but sometimes I turn on those shows and I'm just like amazed. I don't recognize the country that they're talking about. But people are very angry and they give very, very different points of view. So obviously, politics is getting tighter. I don't remember all that many rallies when I was a kid of people yelling, "Lock her up." Right? And the kinds of charges that people made about President Trump also are kind of new. I'm not making any comment about what should happen about any of that stuff, but I'm just noting there is a certain new edginess in American political mobilization and rhetoric. Why? And why is this extending to foreign policy as well as to domestic? And thought is, it's actually not because of cable news. It's not because we have somehow lost the virtuous spirit of our ancestors, though perhaps we should be thinking a little bit more about that than we do. But it is because American society is changing. And change is disruptive. And the changes are kind of basic. Again, maybe we color the past a little bit too much nostalgia. But people had this feeling in the old days that if one member of a couple had a job, A, they were going to keep that job. They weren't going to be laid off. That, their company wasn't going to close down. And B, that one job would provide enough of an income for a normal American family to live a pretty good life. Be able to have a house, car, save up a bit, maybe a boat. And the kids could go to college and get better jobs. And that this was all kind of easy. And then at the time of retirement, there would be a nice, safe, secure, defined benefit pension. Sometimes I find you have to explain to people under 40 what a defined benefit pension is, because unless they work for the government, they don't really know what that is. Life seemed good. Life seemed to be getting better. And life seemed, I'm not going to say outrageously easy, but okay easy. Now, it's more complicated. It's a lot harder for young families to start up, to get a house. Students are carrying around a lot more student debt than they used to. The kind of student loan debt that you see sometimes is roughly equal to what a home mortgage used to look like not all that long ago in this country. People who have jobs are not so sure their jobs are going to be there in 5 or 10 years. What was that company that used to sell all those videos? Blockbuster Video, right? Everybody remember that? I mean, people were thinking, I got this great career. I'm being promoted from within. I'm moving up to management. And, people are always going to want entertainment. It's, where is it now? So, industries are changing. Jobs are changing. We don't know where we're going to be. And the cost of college is going up, and the cost of health care is going up. And people feel insecure. It's funny, in the old days, American industry used to make actually, I hate to admit it, but kind of crappy products. There was this guy, Ralph Nader, who used to write all these books about how terrible the cars that General Motors and the big three automakers did, and lots of stuff about how your food was unhealthy. And back in the old days, they had these things. Some of you kids may have seen them in a museum, these rotary phones that you had to plug into the wall. And there was only one phone company. The thing is, we would all like to have the kinds of jobs people had in those days. When there was only one phone company, guess what? It was very, very hard to get fired from the phone company, right? And the phone company could afford to pay you pretty well because they could just charge more, and no one could, and basically the phone company would say, oh, you don't like the kind of service we give you? Well, don't have a phone. You don't need a phone. Don't have a phone. So we would all like the kind of jobs that existed in the 1950s and 60s, but we don't want the products. So as a society, we're not sure where we're going. We're worried about the future of our kids. We know that globalization has something to do with this. The tougher competition, low-wage workers in other countries, companies that are sometimes supported by state industry and state subsidies from abroad coming to compete with the United States. And we're not sure what to do about that, and we worry. But here's the other part. After World War II, when we started to build this more stable society, more affluent society, happier in some ways society, we also began to build this post-World War II world order. So instead of having a war every 20 years, France and Germany would learn to get along, right? We'd have NATO, and we'd bind all these countries together, and we'd stop having World War I, World War II, World War III, etc. We just wouldn't do that anymore. And so we developed these deep forms of institutional cooperation between all these countries. And while this was not utopia, it didn't work equally well for everybody everywhere, it was a lot better than anything that people had seen before 1945 or before 1914. It felt like progress. But part of what made that work was that the politicians in all of these different countries were presiding over societies that weren't so torn by conflict within, because people's living standards were going up. People in other countries were enjoying what we were having in the United States: secure jobs, rising standards of living. So politicians had trust from people. Said, look, your life is better than it's ever been, plus the Germans aren't marching over the border anymore. So, okay, I tell you we need to make this trade deal. I know some of you don't really like it, but have I led you wrong before? No. I've told you we should do something, we did it, and it kind of worked out okay. So there was a certain trust between leaders and the led. Now what you see is the angriness, say, in France of the Gilets jaunes, the anger in England over Brexit in the UK. In Germany, you have populist parties, right and left, and you have a kind of sullen thinking the rest of those Europeans just want to take all our euros away to subsidize their cheating habits. The Italians are angry at the Germans because they didn't get enough aid for the euro problems, on and on and on. And meanwhile, of course, Putin is out there kind of picking away and trying to unravel these institutions and these forms of cooperation. But it's now a lot harder for, say, President Macron to say, you know what, we need friendship among the Western nations, so I'm going to make a really, really generous offer to Britain over Brexit. Because he doesn't have that much room at home. People are already angry. They're not getting enough. Our leaders aren't helping us. Our leaders don't really care about us. So they don't want to hear about his wonderful plans for England or Germany. They want to, France first. Make France great again. UK first. Make Britain great again. Finland first. So it's getting harder and harder for countries to cooperate. Even as the problems in the international space are getting tougher. Because there is a rising China. And while not everything about a rising China is bad, there are a lot of concerns that China's neighbors and we have about some of the consequences of some of China's behavior. Russia seems to have decided that it wants to change the way security and geopolitics works in the European space. So for the first time since World War II, we had Russia invade another country, and which it had signed a treaty that it wouldn't attack, and in fact would defend, and annex the Crimea in defiance of the international community. That's the kind of thing people used to do before 1939. It was one of the kinds of things we were hoping we could stop. But at just the time we need to cooperate about these new threats, there is less political will in the Western world and in other countries to cooperate, and leaders have less of a margin of public trust. And when you talk to political leaders of both parties, no cameras, off the record, you'll find that political leaders will tell you this, that I'm under pressure. I know that I should advocate such and such, but I can't explain that to the voters. Or if I do that, I'll be primaried in the campaign. And it's not just American leaders. If you go to Europe, if you go to parts of Asia, you'll hear this same kind of refrain. So, both within countries and among countries, life is getting more tumultuous and uncertain. Politics is getting more risky, and there's more potential for things to go wrong. And the resources, the margin of political security, political strength that people have to address solutions and to seek creative solutions is shrinking. Okay, that is not maybe the most cheerful outlook that I could give you. And I would say that my expectation based on this is that we're going to have some more turbulence, both within countries and between countries. I like to tell my students that my generation decided that we would leave a few world problems unsolved because we felt that you wouldn't have a chance to really grow into full maturity if you didn't have the experience of really having to grapple with hard issues. So I hope you're thanking us for giving you such an interesting world to look out on as you finish your education. But at the same time, and I want to kind of give you a little bit of an up note here. I do think that we should remember that what's really happening in the world is actually called progress. That is, humanity is acquiring the ability to do things we could never do before. We can generate wealth. When you think of, we all go around today, there's so much inequality in America, and all these rich fortunes, and look how powerful Facebook is and how terrible it is. Yes, there are problems. Things need to be dealt with. But think of all that money that wasn't there 20 years ago. Think of all that communicative ability. Think that, each of us in our pockets with our phones has more information processing capacity and more sort of reach into the world of information and entertainment than whole countries had in 1965. My guess is that there are people in this room whose kids are going to live with a medical system where the average person will get medical care that is 1,000 times better than Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos can get today, and it won't cost very much. That we are seeing diseases cured, we are seeing new research into longevity, we are seeing a whole range of new ideas and new capacities. And so yes, society is in upheaval as these new and exciting things roll out of the laboratories and into reality. Our institutions are being shaken. Our economies are being challenged. Our old habits are no longer good enough, and we have to learn and we have to keep up. But it's progress. It's things are getting better. I think it means that even though society is going to have bigger problems than before, we're going to have a greater capacity to solve them. So, in conclusion, it does work. What advice would I have for young people today? I don't have any advice for people my age, just, keep going, keep moving. But for young people, given that you're going into this world of change, of polarization, of bitterly contested foreign and domestic policy, rapid change in the economy, challenges to the environment, to peace, what should you do? Really, two very simple things. First is work on your character. Just become a better person. No matter what happens out there, your ability to work hard, to stick at it, to form friendships and emotional relationships, to hold up your end of a bargain, to be able to make your life better, all of that, just keep it going, because that will make everything better. It's the foundation of it all. The other is study history. The future is not going to be the same as the past. The past is not an infallible guide to the future, but the past is what we've got. Learning how things have gone wrong in the past and how things went right in the past is the best preparation you can give yourself for working to make the world a better place. And your contributions are urgently needed. So I hope many of you will get out there and use your educations for some good. And don't end up like Alexander Hamilton, killed in a duel with a political opponent. All right? It's just, try to see if there's another way to settle your differences with Aaron Burr. Okay, thank you very much. Okay? All right.
You left us with one half of Machiavelli's recommendation, study history. But Machiavelli was not so interested in the character, not interested in your definition of good character. So, I wanted to ask some questions about the place where you work at the Hudson Institute, Washington, D.C., the national capital. And in particular, since you started picking on Senator Kyle, so I'll continue that theme. Congress as an institution and the relationship between Congress and the president. In all of the turbulent episodes, very heated, contested episodes about American trade policy, wars, America's place in the world, there is an expectation about Congress as an institution being able to take in all of these diverse views, deal with all of the heat, and deliberate and argue with itself, then with the executive branch, including the State Department and the military, right? And come up with reasonable policies, more reasonable than not. And there's a concern that in this particular era of polarization, something has really broken down within the Congress and in the relationship between the Congress and the executive branch that's different. Is it different, or should we expect more of these institutions, or is that an unfair standard?
No, I think many people, and people actually on both sides of the aisle, would say that Congress these days, for some time, Congress has been not up to the standard that we need. And that's one of the reasons that over the last 50 years, there's been a fairly steady flow of power away from Congress, both toward the executive and toward the judiciary. And it is better. For most of our history, Congress was the place where the really big decisions in America were taken. Presidents were less important. They weren't unimportant. They weren't chopped liver. But Congress was in charge of many things. And when we were in points of national crisis, I can remember the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under Senator William Fulbright in the Vietnam War held very important hearings. And there have been other episodes in American life where legislation passed by Congress, public debates in Congress were key. One of the things that happens when Congress no longer functions as well as the nation's debating society is that debates do tend to go to cable news platforms and other things. So we do need, and one of the things that has happened, I think, is that we need more people in Congress who think about the institution, who aren't just, in the House or in the House as a stepping stone to the Senate, or in the Senate as a stepping stone to the White House, right? We have many more. I think Jack Kennedy came from the Senate to Congress. I think before that you had to go back really long time to find somebody who went from the Senate to Congress. That's more of a pattern now. And you find so many senators running for Congress. Again, with all due respect to them, and it's quite possible some of them would make excellent presidents. I'm not trying to judge on that. We need more senators in the Senate and fewer in Iowa. And we also, I think we may need to think about the way Congress is staffed. I myself think Congress is understaffed. And that, when you think about the long, complex bills that move through there, and the very difficult questions that have to be answered in there, I think Congress actually needs more help. Now, a lot of people say, oh my goodness, you're just going to lard up Washington with all these people and so on. There's a problem there. But Congress needs better tools. So that, I think, that our constitutional system is a tricycle with 3 wheels. I think the congressional wheel's a bit flat, and that is making the whole thing wobble. It's probably a terrible metaphor, but I'm trying.
Your book, Special Providence, put out into the discourse about American foreign policy this idea that there have always been and probably always would be these distinct sort of schools or strains of thinking, and you named them mostly after presidents, Hamilton being the exception, but 2 of them generally more inward-looking and thinking about America, not quite America first, but and then 2 of them being more outward international in their thinking from the 18th century, right?
Yep.
So it would, and you wrote a very fine essay while President Trump was candidate Trump, more than one essay, suggesting, well, the success of a candidate like Donald Trump and America First is a revival of a Jacksonian spirit in American domestic debates about foreign policy. So is there a connection between the question about Congress and Congress not functioning so well and the resurgence of a sort of inward-looking, the dominance of a more inward-looking tone? Are they totally separate? The populism and the inward-looking turn, that's one thing, and what's going on in Congress is a separate thing, or is there some connection between the?
I'm sure there are connections, but when I think about the inward turn, I look at what, during the Cold War, you didn't have a total consensus. There were a lot of arguments during the Cold War about American foreign policy. But basically, the people who believed in a big global foreign policy, whether they were sort of Wilsonian human rights enthusiasts or Hamiltonian free traders or whatever, the world order builders were also in alliance with Jacksonians who didn't care so much about all this world order stuff, but really didn't want the Soviet Union to win the Cold War. So there was a kind of a strong consensus for that policy. In 1992, the Soviet Union goes away. And you saw 2 different reactions. In the foreign policy establishment, what you saw was fantastic. Now that the Soviet Union has fallen, we can really build a world order. Because now we don't have the Soviets fighting it, so we can have universal democracy. We can turn GATT into the World Trade Organization and bring China into it. We can really change. We can bring peace to the Middle East. We can do all these things we would like to do, and that the foreign policy establishment is really eager to work on. All right, but if you then you think about the presidential election of 1992, you had George H.W. Bush, one of the great foreign policy presidents ever. He wins the Cold War. Not only does he win the first Gulf War with Iraq, but he gets other countries to pay for it. Okay, that's pretty good. But his opponent is this really nice, friendly guy, Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, doesn't have any foreign policy experience, And he thinks we should be doing less nation building abroad and be thinking more about America, and Clinton wins. Next time we have a vacancy in the White House, 2008. We've got Al Gore, the grand statesman, the climate change guy, the man who knows every world leader and is very experienced, has been around for all the big decisions. And then we have this governor of Texas. He's a very nice guy, doesn't have any foreign policy experience per se, thinks America's been doing too much foreign policy and should do less, kinder, gentler nation. All this is before 9/11, and he wins. 2008, you've got Senator John McCain, the great pillar of the American foreign policy establishment, one of the most seriously qualified foreign policy people ever to run for president of the United States. And then there is a former state senator from Illinois, one term in the Senate, nice guy, no foreign policy experience, who thinks we've done too much in foreign policy and need to come home, and Barack Obama wins. Then in 2016, you have Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, been all over the world, knows every world leader, really is ready. You can tell she's going to pivot to Asia, and she's going to have this great foreign policy. And then you've got Donald Trump, who doesn't really know that much about foreign policy and thinks we should be doing less. All right? So I would say we've been getting a very clear electoral signal over and over and over and over, and basically been ignoring the signal. And I think at this point, some people just decided to pull on the emergency brake. And so I think the foreign policy establishment, including me and my friends, because I do think America does need to be involved globally, we need to think a lot harder about what those policies are and how do we make the case to people that that really is important to the average American.
There's a set of issues there about how we elect presidents that we have become much more small d democratic. So in the Special Providence book, you have a nice chart. I used to use that. I still use it with students about how many of the early presidents had served as Secretary of State.
Yeah.
George Washington being the exception because he was the only executive period from the Revolutionary War to vice president. But and as you just described, that is certainly not the pattern now. But let's take for granted, in the question period we could talk about that. Let's take for granted that we have a more populist, small d democratic way of electing presidents. What arguments can be made by students, citizens, analysts, scholars who are interested in, see the need for America to be a leader in international affairs? What kind of arguments can be made in this more populist, small d democratic climate to persuade the common person that we ought to take a leadership role? Here are the reasons why.
Well, I would say, first thing to start with, and this is not a very popular answer among my colleagues, but I think it's an important one, is look in the mirror and ask yourself, where have you been getting it wrong? Because I remember back in the 2016 primaries, when you had so many Republican candidates running who had, Marco Rubio, and very, very interesting arguments they wanted to make about foreign policy. But there was the shadow of the Iraq War. And none of them, except for Donald Trump, was able to say, we went into this Iraq war and it really didn't work out the way we wanted it to. Here's what we've learned from that. And here's why, if we ever get back in, we won't do the same thing because we're smarter than we used to be because we've learned from this. All right? People didn't want to have that conversation. In the same way on the Democratic side, in the election campaign, Secretary Clinton, who I like and admire as a human being, I honestly do. It makes a lot of my Republican friends crazy when I say this. I like her. She, wasn't able to say, okay, here's why we were in Benghazi and what was wrong with it. Not necessarily all the stuff that some of the Republicans have been screaming about, but the Libya intervention was supposed to be a humanitarian intervention, and it created this terrible disaster. And the Obama administration thought it was going to bring democracy to Egypt with all of its clever democracy promotion and all of this. And it ended up with a worse dictatorship in Egypt than ever before. Okay, so let's have some candid talk about what went wrong and why we're going to do things differently now. And I think that could begin, that kind of conversation can begin to get people's trust. And it needs to happen. It really needs to happen.
One last question for me before we turn to the audience. As I mentioned before, I'm with you. I agree with half of Machiavelli's recommendation, study history. But the other half, I'm with you about character. And one theme we have talked about in this school as an American civic, character and virtue, a term you used, is to rediscover the importance of debate, of real disagreement. But that means civil disagreement. It means an underlying civic friendship that Americans can have with each other about very difficult issues. These questions of foreign policy, as you mentioned, are about people's jobs. It can be about life and death.
Right.
Very serious moral questions. So what further advice would you have? There are those of us who are too old to learn anything, but for the younger ones, why take seriously the civic virtue of listening and arguing and deliberating and debating across very different views?
Well, you know, there are two good reasons for doing this. They're a little in tension with each other, but one of them is if people feel you're really listening to them and that you understand them, you have a better chance of persuading them, right? Not only you have a better chance because they're going to kind of like you better and trust you more, but also when you understand the way they think and the way they see the world, you can look at problems from their point of view and find solutions and ways of thinking about problems that make sense to that other person. And you can only do this by talking to people who have different views. But on the other hand, there's something else. Sometimes I actually learn something new. It's kind of shocking, I know, but when somebody disagrees, I have a cousin who's very pro-Trump, and you know, you can count on him to say something or put something on Facebook that will really annoy a lot of other people, and I'm not sure that I kind of can walk that path either. But I not only learn about, you know, how a Trump voter sees things, but I learn actually sometimes he's referring to something I didn't know what happened actually is real and it matters, and I need to include that in my thinking. Doesn't mean I'm going to end up with the same ideas he has about it, but you learn something from listening carefully to people who don't agree with you. Something that we're doing, I belong to a little church in Washington, and we started doing this thing of we have these meetings where we pick a hot topic and we try to bring people together from the church. We start with prayer. We often end with having a communion service. So the idea is we try to wrap the civic disagreement in reminding us that there are principles bigger than politics that we agree on and that are important. But then the encouragement is on people, say what you think. Be honest. Be open, share. And you know, it's been very interesting. I think it's actually helped a lot of us. It makes friendships healthier. It makes disagreement less toxic. And I think it makes us all wiser to know how the other half sees it.
Well, with that, we'd like to listen to what you have to say. There will be a microphone in the center aisle here. We ask you to think about a brief question you'd like to ask. That means two parts. It's brief, and it really is a question for Walter. So we do have a tradition of having students ask the first question. So if we could get any brave students who might want to step forward. Sure.
You don't have to be that brave. I don't bite.
Hi, I don't know if this is on.
Yes.
My name is Brian. I'm a junior here. I'm studying journalism and business global politics. I wanted to go back to something that you guys were discussing about the electorate really choosing candidates who weren't foreign policy focused. how do you make the electorate care about foreign policy? Like when I think about, I'm from the Midwest, my parents care about, the pothole in the road or state spending on education. They don't have time to think about what's happening abroad. How do you get every American to care about foreign policy on some level?
That is a really good question. I think the answer, there's no one answer, because different people, you have to understand what the people you're talking to care about, and then you have to build a bridge. So if I were in the Middle West, one of the things I might really talk about, start the conversation with, is a conversation, say, about tariffs in China, which a lot of people in the Middle West are discovering, I can't sell my soybeans, or I've got an actual real-life important experience here. If I were in West Virginia, I might talk about climate change and its impact on the coal industry. If you're talking to someone who really cares about women's rights, again, it just depends on the person. And so I think the first qualification to be an effective foreign policy expert in America today is the ability to listen. Because I think, in the Cold War, it's kind of everybody sort of knew. People my age remember, when I was 10 years old, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we literally did have nuclear bomb drills in my school, getting under the desk to prepare yourself for the nuclear attack. And even at 10 years old, you sort of knew that this might not work.
I remember that feeling. That's right.
Right. Okay. So if you're interested, you could assume that other people were going to be interested in foreign policy. And so I think the foreign policy elite, the foreign policy establishment lost the habit of trying to connect the issues they care about with the issues other people care about so that they can see the connection. So we've got to relearn that habit.
We have two students from the Alexander Hamilton Society, the local ASU chapter, who are
All right.
next at the microphone.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak here. So you talked about how our political leaders feel pressure, and that sometimes gets in the way of them voicing their own opinions on issues. How much of that pressure do you think comes from within their own party, as opposed to from voters on the other side of the aisle, and how does that affect the way they engage with foreign policy?
Well, Senator Kyle may be able to correct me here, but my assumption is, my experience of Washington life, which is much less than some people's, is that people are actually a little bit more worried about their own party than the other party most of the time. And part of that reason is primary challenges. You get a primary challenge and you have to spend a lot of money and you go pre-wounded into the general election. So, if the friendly fire is sometimes the fire you really have to watch out for.
Hi, my name is Cameron Vega, and my question for you is, in a Congress that is very lowercase d democratic, how do you ensure that if the invitation to struggle between foreign policy goes in favor of Congress and they take more of their authority away from the president in that regard, how do you ensure that they're still responsive to our allies and to foreign policy topics when they're most concerned in the elections about their own constituents?
That is a very good question. It's actually one of the reasons that the Founding Fathers did ensure, even when Congress was a lot stronger than it is now, the president has more power in foreign policy than in most other areas, because you do need a strong executive. We need to be able to speak to the rest of the world with one voice. So the pendulum could swing too far the other way. But ultimately, there is only one security in our system of government, and that is the wisdom of the American people. And we cannot have a government, that is better, that makes better decisions than the American people are making. So in many ways, the quality of Congress depends on what people out of Congress are doing. We think of if you're going to be an expert in foreign policy, we think, well, you should be in a think tank in Washington. Maybe you shouldn't be. Maybe you should be somebody who's recognized as a leader in your community, and you would just, feel a vocation to learn about foreign policy and learn about international matters and be someone local who people trust when they're trying to figure these things out. so that American public opinion from the grassroots up is wiser. And so I think, Congress needs some reforms and needs to do things, but we need to have if the people is not electing, isn't choosing the right people, it's hard to then turn around and blame Congress if the result isn't great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good evening. Quick two-part question. First, I would like your opinion with respect to the following premise. We have an all-volunteer army. Would you agree that at least 70% of the people who volunteer for the Army come from the Jacksonian tradition in the United States? Second part of the question, if that's true, does going to the all-volunteer Army, has that changed the way that foreign policy coalitions can be built in America? Because essentially, if America is going to engage in small warfare, the bleeding is limited to one element of the four-part foreign policy traditions that you talked about in Special Providence. Thank you.
All right. Well, yeah, it is the shift to an all-volunteer army was one of the very important shifts that took place in this country as the Cold War, really in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And it has changed things. But we should remember that in most of American history, we've had an all-volunteer army. That we had our first, only during the Civil War and World War I and World War II did we have the draft. And it was only after World War II, when we realized that the Cold War was going to be with us for a long time, that we went to a peacetime draft. So in some ways, this is not some crazy new experiment. This is actually a return to America as it was. Now, the Army is bigger than it used to be, and that makes a difference. The political composition of the Army is more complicated than you might think, because yes, you have a lot of Jacksonians, let's say, let's stereotype a little bit, Southern whites, and people from Appalachia do disproportionately enroll in the military, and that's a culture that puts a lot of value on that. But you look at a group of soldiers or sailors, others, you see lots of different colors, and you see lots of different political backgrounds. So I wouldn't say that our Army is all one thing or all another. I do think that when you have the people giving orders to an Army or voting on what an Army should do have never been in the Army and don't plan to go in the Army and don't think their kids are going to go in the Army, there's a little bit more of an idea of, well, sometimes you have to spend a few lives, a more willingness to use American forces as okay, we're not going to win the war in Afghanistan anytime soon, but I don't want to suffer political embarrassment if we lose, so I'm just going to let a few more soldiers, go through that experience and maybe get killed, and I'm okay with that. I'm not saying, by the way, that's the only reason people support the war in Afghanistan, but it has been a factor, I think, in some people's thinking. So there are dangers to it. But one of the things that I think is terrific is that so many people in both parties are now running for Congress and the Senate are veterans. We have a new generation of veterans in the country, and it's very interesting that voters seem to like that. They seem to take, it's not that the voters are all militaristic and want us to keep fighting more and more wars. It's more like, well, you know what? If you put your life on the line for this country, maybe you mean what you say. Maybe that tells me something about you. So maybe we're going to have a better decision-making process.
So within a primarily divided yet inclusive discussion, how do you go about and what's your stance on using rhetoric? When we go to speak our thoughts and opinions, should we do it in a manner that addresses everyone, or having that direct conversation with the person you're directly speaking to? Is rhetoric good in a discussion, or is it more for an argument?
All right, that's a really useful question. And I think I'm going to give you a terrible answer, which is it depends.
Okay.
But fundamentally, the art of rhetoric we should call it the art of persuasion.
Yeah.
That what you're trying to, rhetoric is not like using certain kinds of speech or certain, figures of speech. Rhetoric is about getting, persuading this person or these people to see your point of view, share your point of view. And so you have to know your audience. And sometimes you'll have somebody who asks, in a question period, there might be somebody who appears and is really kind of representing a widespread feeling in the audience, and you try to do that. And sometimes you want to address a very specific point by a very specific person. You also, this is again something I learned from my father, who, when you think about it, preachers do a lot of speaking to a lot of different kinds of audience. So if you have preachers in your life, go ask them what they know, what they've learned about communicating with people, because they can probably give you some tips. But sometimes my dad would sometimes be talking to everybody, and then sometimes he'd have somebody very specific in mind for another point of the sermon. He might look at them too and give them the hairy eyeball or whatever. So you need to know your audience, know your people, and then try to tailor your responses to what they need and want.
Awesome. Thank you.
2 last questions we have time for.
Hi, my name is Cormac Doubling. I'm a Baird student here at SCETL. First and foremost, I wanted to thank you for coming here. And when you're in DC in the hot and humid summer, just remember we've got a much better dry heat here. I totally agree with what you were saying about America's role in the world, but I just kind of want to play devil's advocate for a little bit.
Sure.
Why should we be leaning into international institutions and our traditional allies in Europe when they seem like they're in even more disarray than we are? Britain is heading for disaster. Angela Merkel is starting to lose popularity in Germany. Macron, who we were hoping was going to win the French election, is unpopular too. Why should we put so much faith in those institutions and allies?
Okay.
NATO and
Yeah.
in particular.
Well, the best answer, the bottom line answer, is that when things go bad in Europe, bad things have a way of happening to the United States. If Franklin Roosevelt, and I don't blame him because public opinion wouldn't have let him, but if he'd been able to say to Britain and France in 1934, listen, this character Hitler over there is really bad news. And it looks to me like he's going to try and tear up the Treaty of Versailles. I just want you guys to know that if you want to make a move, we've got your back. All right? I think if he had done that, 50 million people might not have died in World War II. So, and ditto, if his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had been able to say to the German Kaiser back in 1906, Will, you're a terrific guy, and we like Germany too. But you need to understand that America is not going to allow you to destroy the balance of power in Europe and dominate Europe. We're not going to. So don't even try. And furthermore, just to make that point clear, I'm sending some naval ships around just to say hello, friendly visit.
Like Teddy Roosevelt would want.
Yeah, we might have missed World War I, and that would have been no communism, no fascism, no Holocaust. Okay, so one thing to think about is that in international politics, an ounce of prevention is worth 10 tons of cure. And that, trying to nip small problems in the bud is a lot better than letting them fester and explode into horrible world conflagrations. So I would at least suggest that to people.
Excellent. Thank you.
Final question.
Yep. I had a question regarding, you mentioned how within the West there's an increasing draw into isolationism. Yet you did advocate, the increase of trying to bring foreign policy back to the center of the stage. So I really want to ask, though, is that what do you think is going to happen? Do you think we actually will be able to rescue foreign policy in the eye of the public, or do you think that it's more likely that geopolitical scenarios will force America back into the realm of foreign policy, such as, the rise of China?
Bad
Russian
scenarios.
imperialism?
Yeah. Well, I was joking about this before the talk, but you say that one of the lessons of history is that people don't learn the lessons of history. And that very often people end up having to learn by bitter experience things they should have been able to learn by reading books. But, you know, and America historically, we've basically, you know, the world has had to whack us over the head with a 2x4 to make us pay attention and do something. And I think, again, we've had some bad experiences in the 20th century. And the question is, can we keep, you know, can we help new generations learn from that bitter and expensive and painful experience? Or are they going to have to learn on their own? I can't answer that question, but what seems clear to me is that we should try to make it easier for people to learn from history rather than to learn from experience, because believe me, it is less painful to learn from history.
All right, thank you.
Well, before we give a final thanks to Walter, I just have a few closing announcements. As you can imagine, events like this take quite a lot of work, and an entire series like this takes quite a lot of work. So I want to begin by saying thank you to our public affairs team and our events team. So Dr. Carol McNamara, who's somewhere here, is our associate director of the school for public programs, and she coordinates our events team, which would include Catherine and Taylor, other people in the school staff. Lauren, Gala is here, our student workers, our communications team. I mentioned Lauren, but Joe as well. So I'm grateful to all of them for all the work that they do. I do want to encourage especially the students to pick up some information out there before you go to the reception. Maybe pick up some literature, that reading that Walter Russell Mead mentioned. Courses for the fall, but also to learn about our major and our minor. But people of all ages here are welcome to pick up some of that information and tell your friends, family about it. We'd have one final event in this Polarization and Civil Disagreement series. Danielle Allen, a professor of political philosophy at Harvard University, will be here on April 4th to close on an uplifting note about civic education as one way of understanding and addressing this issue of polarization. Thanks again to our partners we've had, the Cronkite School, the O'Connor College of Law, Arizona PBS, and especially again tonight, the student-led Alexander Hamilton Society chapter that's here on campus. So I hope you will join us for the reception, and please join me one last round of applause for Walter Russell Mead. Thank you.